Back in the early 80s, I was invited by the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development to edit a book called Developing Minds. And in order to do this, I invited people from throughout the world who were very familiar and leaders in thinking skills. And I invited them to send in chapters for me to consider in the book. So I invited people like David Perkins from Harvard, Edward de Bono from Malta, Bob Sternberg from Yale, John Bransford, Alan Glatthorn from University of Pittsburgh, and so on. And I began receiving all of these chapters related to thinking skills and what good thinkers are. And as I was editing them, I began to see some similarities and some patterns and some commonalities among all of them. Now, they didn't all say exactly the same thing or use the same words, but they were describing what is it that good thinkers do. I also looked at definitions of critical thinking from Bob Ennis and Alec Fisher and so on, and began to see some patterns. And so I started putting them together. And while one person may have said, well, like de Bono said, well, collect all facts, for example, as part of his court process. But then Bob Ennis said, well, you need to think before you act. Don't jump to conclusions. And so I began to see some patterns here. And so I began to link them together and to classify them. At the same time, I was working with Reuven Feuerstein, the Israeli psychologist. And he had a program called Instrumental Enrichment. And what he was doing was describing the attributes of good thinkers and how he was training good thinkers to become even more effective in their thinking. And so he gave me some classification names as well. Well, I began to put these together, and we started with about 7 habits of mind. And then we moved to 10, and then 12, and now we have 16. And so what these are really are a synthesis of what effective thinkers do in many walks of life. For example, Alan Glatthorn and Jonathon Barron describe what the good thinker does. And what they did was to look at entrepreneurs and salespeople and artists and physicians and auto mechanics and salespeople and teachers. And they said, what is it about these people that make them so very, very effective? Why are they such good decision makers? What is it about them that make them such good problem solvers? And they began to identify effective problem solving in many walks of life. And so what the habits of mind are is a synthesis of attributes of effective thinkers from many walks of life. And behind that are studies of effective people, psychological studies, people who have made a career out of studying critical thinking and effective thinking, and so it's a synthesis of many of those labels. Over the years, we of course have added to those habits of mind and done even more research. And so we find that as we add to the research, there's more and more support for these habits of mind. For example, the last habit of mind that we added to the list, number 16, was remaining open to continuous learning. And the reason why we added it is because we studied what very effective people do who are peak performers, people who are at the top of their craft, the Mikhail Baryshnikovs of the world, the world's leading danseurs and potters and artists. And it was very interesting that to a person, they said, but I've got so much more to learn. They exhibited a humility of learning. And so we said, here is another habit of mind because it's a description of what very effective thinkers do. So basically then, the habits of mind are a synthesis of studies of effective thinking by people in many, many walks of life, and we've subjected them to further research, and we seem to find more and more that they hold up.